Good morning, class. Welcome to week 5, chapter 3 of Introduction to Philosophy. This chapter is going to be on the concept of God. And one of the interesting things about this chapter is that practically everything can be covered in it by reviewing the opening and closing questions. So that's how I'm going to approach introducing this chapter, by introducing the opening and closing questions. And again, for this week's assignment, simply choose one opening and one closing question. Now, the first thing to focus on in this chapter is realizing just the varieties of concepts of God, the varieties of qualities of God, and the vocabulary associated with it. So the first question brings out some of the vocabulary, and the second one does too. So the question asks, do you believe in God? If your answer is yes, you are a theist, no matter which particular concept of God you believe in. There is a bit of disagreement on to what extent theist refers to a personal God as opposed to a deist, a more mechanistic God, and definitely look for that in the chapter. But for the most part, that's a correct assessment. If your answer is no, you are an atheist. And again, they're using Greek terminology. In Greek, the alpha in front of a word often negates something. And so theist and then the alpha in front of it would mean the negation of that. If you don't know, you are an agnostic. And again, the same thing with the alpha privative. Gnostic means knowledge, and the A in front of it negates the knowledge, meaning that you do not have knowledge either way of whether God exists or does not exist. And so this question, if you choose to answer it, it allows you to utilize that vocabulary. This might not be the best question to answer for a lengthy answer. If you, I would just sort of reflect on this question to master the vocabulary, some of the initial vocabulary. Let's move to question 2. What are the most prominent features of God? This question is just as important if you are an agnostic or an atheist. It is important to know what it is you don't believe in or don't know. Perhaps you don't believe in a fatherly God who looks after us, but you do believe in some vital force or prime mover. That God, the universe, that got the universe going in the first place, for example. So yeah, so regardless of your stance, whether it falls into the theistic, atheistic, or agnostic categories, what are you either negating, affirming, or unsure about? And so some of the qualities, omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and how exactly do you imagine that? Some of the sort of ways of conceptualizing that may seem hard to imagine are those questions like, can God make a rock so heavy that God can't lift it, or make a chili so spicy that God can't taste it? So what do you mean by omnipotent? All-knowing or omniscient is also an aspect of God. Did God create the universe, or in the paradigm you're thinking about, is the universe eternal and God only sort of creates other aspects in the universe? Does God care about human beings? Does God have emotions? If so, which ones? And in many scriptures, they portray either a God, the God, or gods as having a variety of emotions. Is God distinct and separate from the world he, she, or it created? Is God knowable to us? Can God take, or has God ever taken human form, whether an avatar, incarnation, or something like that? Right, so this question, and I would encourage question 2, this really allows you to sort of list the varieties of qualities you think about when you think about God. And this again is more of a hermeneutical exercise, meaning a sort of a study or an inquiry into what words mean, particularly the word God in this example. Um, when you hear this word, what do you think of? What don't you think of? And more importantly, philosophically, why? And again, we're not touching on belief yet per se, but we're examining the concept that you have, which you're considering belief, disbelief, or suspension of judgment, which would be more the agnosticism here. And then our third question, why do you believe in God? Why don't you believe in God? So this is a very, very brief question, but it can be a very complex answer. If you choose to answer this one, I would approach it somewhat philosophically, meaning two things. One is, now the opening questions are there before the chapter begins, but if you choose to do them, definitely read the chapter first. Even though you might want to, because they're opening questions, you might want to jot down an initial answer before you read the chapter, and then just sort of go back and add to that answer before. And the reason I say this is because the chapter provides many arguments, traditional arguments for the existence and non-existence of God. And so I would definitely look at all of these arguments before you turn in your final answer and see if the reasons that you have for belief, disbelief, or suspension of judgment are similar to the reasons or a reason or an argument given in this book. And some of the ones to look for belief would be the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, and I think they also have Pascal's wager in here. And some of the ones to look for disbelief, and there are counters to all of those arguments as well, would be the problem of evil. And we'll get into that in the closing questions. One of the things that a lot of students say for belief in God, and although this is a very true and honest answer, it might not by itself be the most philosophical answer, is that that's how I was raised. And although that may very well be true, you want to maybe look at that a bit more. Don't just state that answer as the complete answer, right? That assumes a bit more, I would argue, that it's still a positive thing, or that there's still a some type of logic to it. So if we imagine something negative, and you say, do you believe in this or this part of your life, and it's a negative thing as opposed to a positive thing, and you say, well, yes, I do, and it's how I was raised, you might ask the further question, well, okay, I understand that, but why do you still given this? And then if it's a negative thing, you would perhaps be more critical of it. If it's a positive thing, or a thing that had coherence, as religion does for many people, and belief in the divine, then you would state other reasons. So it's not necessarily just because of this. That may have been what caused you to have the belief in the first place, but we're kind of asking, and given that you were or were not raised that way, why do you still? So keep that in mind if you answer question 3. It's not just what we might give as a sociological answer if you're taking a survey on belief or disbelief, and you could just check was raised that way, learned about it from another person. Philosophically, that's not necessarily the thoroughness of the answer this question is looking for. Let's go down to the closing questions. I believe that's on 103. Oops. Yeah, 103. And the closing questions have more detail because this is after the chapter is read. So give a general description of God, noting those characteristics without which you would not be willing to use the word God. If you don't believe in God, say with some precision what it is that you don't believe in. And this closing question one would probably go nicely with opening question two, so much so that I'm almost hesitant to say do both of them. But if you do both of them, make this one more thorough. So definitely use the vocabulary words in the chapter. Some traditional concepts of God would involve all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good, or as the second closing question says, concerned with justice and well-being for that, right? So if a person says, well, I can't imagine a God being all three of those things given, say, the problem of evil. Let's take away all powerfulness. Would that say to your concept of God, no, that won't, I can't consider that concept of God. And why or why not? So, or perhaps you imagine God as not having negative emotions. You're okay with, say, the emotions of love and hope and concern for justice, things like that. But you're don't think that God gets angry or some other ways of describing God as jealous. So if God had those characteristics, would that not be considered a concept of God? So that is what you want to do in this question. Again, it doesn't assume belief, disbelief, or agnosticism. It's just the concept you imagine. Question 2 has to deal with something called theodicy, which I'll explain in a moment. If you believe that there is a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and concerned with justice and the well-being of humanity, explain how there can be so much evil and suffering in the world. Pursue as far as you can the responses and objections to one of the various attempts to answer the problem of evil. A good way of doing this is to have a friend act as devil's advocate and try to refute your efforts to defend a solution to a problem. Right. So again, a traditional concept for God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. And the problematic nature of that, given the problem of evil, proceeds in the following way. If God is all-powerful, God could prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, God would know evil is going to happen. If God was all-loving, God wouldn't want the evil to happen to people. And yet there is so much evil and suffering in the world. Given these four ideas, one of them at least seems inconsistent. So a theodicy is an answer to that question. It's a justification for an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God given the problem of evil. And so many people, theologians and others, philosophers, have tried to explain how God can be all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good while evil exists in the world. And I think this particular chapter in the book gives a great example, gives a great survey of the many different solutions to this problem, or possible solutions. And so if you do this question, this is one of the questions I'd also encourage. I think it's a good question. Go through all the different arguments. One is free will. One is the privation of good. One divides moral evil and natural evil, which is an important distinction. And there's one is this justice in the afterlife. So look through all those different arguments and see which ones, if any, you find convincing and why. So for question 3, if you believe in God, try to explain to an atheist friend, real or imagined, why you believe in God. If you think there are good reasons for believing, state them. This is similar to opening question 3. If I wouldn't even do opening question 3. If you want to do opening question 3, do closing question 3 instead. If you think there are good arguments or a proof of God, proof of God's existence, state the argument or the proof and defend it against your atheist friend's objection. If you think that the only way to believe in God is through faith, answer your atheist friend's objection that you are being irrational, that you are simply indulging in wishful thinking, and that you are escaping from the responsibilities to change the world and instead are accepting a fantasy in which God will take full responsibility. So that's a very detailed question. But yes, with this question, you may want to look at some of the rational arguments for God, and you definitely want to pay attention to the way the book distinguishes between rational faith and what is sometimes called irrational faith, or a rational argument for God, and just the idea that is not why individuals believe in God, but it's through a faith that is not necessarily second to rationality. But definitely look at the way the book distinguishes those and some of the philosophers on either side. Question 4. Choose one of the traditional proofs of the existence of God and work it out in some detail. Answer objections and answering objections and making the argument as irrefutable as you can. And so here the traditional proofs are the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, and this book also includes Pascal's wager, which is quite interesting. I believe for the most part, the book makes a very straightforward presentation of both the cosmological and the teleological argument, so I won't go into details on those. Let me provide you right now with what I've found to be the most thorough way of stating the ontological argument, and this was a reworking of Anselm's ontological argument by philosopher Norman Malcolm. Okay, so it goes something like this. The first premise says God either never existed or always existed, meaning, and the reason this is stated first is that God can't be created in this concept of God. If God was created, God would not be all-powerful. Something would be more powerful than God, meaning that thing that created God. So God either always existed, or since God can't be created, if God didn't exist at a certain time, never created, according to this particular concept of God. And see already how the concept is so important. Now, Malcolm will put this in philosophical terms, the always existed or never existed, into therefore God's existence is necessary or impossible. Necessary meaning logically necessary, not necessary in the sense of empirically necessary. And what they mean by logically necessary is that conceptually necessary has nothing to do with cause and effect, right? So if I say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, that's a logical necessity, a conceptual necessity, not a cause and effect necessity. It's definitional, and this is what they're saying as well. So God's existence is either impossible or necessary. And then you would say, well, it is not the case that God's existence is impossible. Again, logically speaking, right? Conceptually speaking, the same way a round square is impossible, right? There's nothing to necessitate that God's existence is logically impossible, and therefore God's existence is necessary. And this is a ontological proof, meaning from the concept itself, just the concept of God, you can prove the existence of God. So this is put forward by Anselm, but also in Descartes' Meditations, he gives two ontological proofs for the existence of God, which we'll look at as well. So this would just be an interesting way of thinking about ways to prove God. That is the ontological argument. Pascal's wager is set up in the Abrahamic context, in which there is a God that exists, and when you die, there is a heaven type realm that you could go to, or a hellish type realm that you could go to. And in a certain sense, Pascal assumes some agnosticism, meaning he's not really sure if God is real and if there's an afterlife or not. But he thinks that, well, let's say I'm wrong about all of this belief in God and the afterlife. But just to sort of be safe, I'm going to go ahead and believe, right? Because you can kind of hedge your bets that way, meaning you can, if you're wrong, what's the worst that can happen? Just you, I think he says, you deny yourself a bit of worldly pleasures, but then in the end, I guess you just cease to exist. But if you're right, or if you err in the other way, let's say you're not sure, so you decide to live as though there weren't any God, then the results, according to Pascal's conception of God, and this again is where the concepts are so important, you have an eternity of torment and just some worldly enjoyments, right? So given the fact, according to Pascal, that you don't really know either way, it would be better to believe just in case it will happen to be true. You would, the gains you would suffer would be so much greater than the infinite gains you would, or eternal gains would be so much greater than the finite temporal losses, and vice versa. So I don't know if that's as much a proof for God as it is a reason, practically speaking, for believing. And question 5. If you don't believe in God, what would convince you that God does exist? If you do believe in God, what would convince you that God does not exist? And so this question, I think, has a lot of maybe both conceptual and pragmatic application. And again, go into detail in your concept of God if you haven't already in another question, if you decide to do this question. Okay, I hope, one more thing. Be sure to distinguish between moral evil and natural evil, especially if you're doing questions like, let me scroll up, question 2, which deals with the problem of evil. A moral evil is negative things that human beings do to each other. So theft, murder, war, these are things that, that we inflict upon ourselves and each other. And this can often be argued that God is not responsible, even the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, if God grants human beings free will. And so this free will often takes the form of solving the notion of, or the concept of moral evil. Natural evils are sort of, we don't really use that word anymore, but we would sort of see the destructive aspect of nature, which at the time that these were being conceived of were associated with God. So these would be things like earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, all types of destructive forces of nature. And again, if we have a certain concept of God, then that would mean that God is ultimately in control of nature, given this concept of God. So a person that believed in this concept of God perhaps would find themselves asking, why would God allow these things to happen? And the free will argument doesn't seem to solve this aspect of evil, the natural evil, so to speak. It could perhaps solve the moral evil, perhaps. But if you do this question, be sure to address that aspect of it. Okay, so this video was a bit longer, but this chapter is quite detailed, and I think that these questions really represented the content of it and will allow you to show that you understand the content of it. Try to utilize vocabulary words when you when you provide answers to the question as well. I think that would help. Okay, hopefully this is helpful. Take care and good luck with the assignment.